Good grief, it's been an exciting few days in the world of cameras. Everyone's just exploding. The new king of the cinema camera is here. There's no competitor at this price point. And while I am certain that we're gonna start seeing more and more of these Pyxis cameras showing up on low-budget indie film sets, I do have to tell you, there actually is a competitor at this price point. I'm not here to knock the Pyxis. I'm here to tell you there is a competitor. And maybe let's look at the whole market before making up our minds. That's all I'm saying. So I do freelance work. I also have my own production company, Easily Amused Group Productions, and I work for another production company whose name I'm not allowed to say, but you've probably heard of it. So for the sake of this video, I'm gonna call that company Company X, because I can't say the name, I don't wanna lose my job. But Company X owns and uses a Blackmagic Ursa Mini Pro and a Zcam E2F6. So for the past couple of years that I've been working for Company X, I've had a lot of hands-on experience with shooting with and editing footage from both of those cameras. Now I do have to admit that prior to getting on with Company X, I had never heard of Zcam. But in the past year that I've been searching for what camera I'm gonna upgrade for my own personal camera, up until last week, up until the announcement of the Pyxis, I was basically ready to pull the trigger on buying a Zcam E2F6 for my own personal use. Now, 99% of what I'm shooting is not run and gun. It's not events or weddings. It's not any situation where I have one chance to get the shot. What I'm shooting primarily is controlled environments with a small crew and a camera that's rigged out where I can take the time to dial in the exposure, to compose the shot, and we can do multiple takes of any shot. That's the world that I primarily live in. And before we move on with talking about which of these cameras or what camera, or just if you're looking to get your camera, what camera you want to get, that's really where you need to start from, is what are you shooting and which camera is going to work best for what you're shooting. When I show up to a set, whether it's with Company X, Easily Amused Group Productions, or my own private freelance stuff, when I show up to shoot something, I'm bringing a truckload of gear with me. I'm not just showing up with just a backpack. I've got all kinds of stuff. I've got the camera, the rig, monitors, lights, stands, rails, dollies, whatever. I've got all kinds of stuff. If you are the kind of person that is showing up to a shoot with just a backpack, I don't think the Pyxis or the E2F6 are meant for you. I think you're probably better off with something more suited to a run and gun style shoot. Whenever I'm on set, 99% of what I shoot, I've got a separate person running audio on a separate audio recorder. I've got a separate person pulling focus on a separate monitor, and my camera is rigged up with a whole bunch of stuff. That's the world that I primarily shoot in. So when the Pyxis was announced, right away I was like, oh man, this is targeting me. I am the target customer for this camera. This camera is not targeting every shooter. Be aware of what camera is meant for you and what isn't. I saw a video of a guy, I don't want to say his name, but he said, I'm confused about the audio port on this camera. Who is it for? If you're confused about the audio port, it's probably not for you. I feel like this camera is aimed at someone who, like me, will be shooting with a small crew. So I've got someone else recording audio on a separate recorder separately. So I don't really care about the audio inputs on the camera. It could have an 1/8" jack for all I care. I'm not using it. And I feel like the target audience for this camera is also not using it. They're also working with a crew and someone else recording audio. And there are multiple things about this camera that fall into that line. They're marketing it as a riggable camera, and the same thing applies for the Zcam. And that's why we wanted the box style camera, so we can rig it. So I'm not putting a microphone on this camera and running it direct into the camera. If ever I was in a situation where I needed to run audio directly into the camera, I'm using a different camera. This is not the camera for that. The point that I want to make, the real point of this video, is there is actually competition for the Pyxis. Let's take a look at both of these cameras. Both the Pyxis and the E2F6 are full frame 6K box style cinema cameras. So they are both meant to be rigged out. And both cameras are $3,000. So maybe let's take a look at these two cameras and see. And honestly, I would love for someone when the Pyxis is available, I would absolutely love for someone to get their hands on it and do a direct comparison between these two cameras. For right now, everything we know about the Pyxis is just theoretical. It's just based on the announcement and the spec sheet. No one's had hands-on yet. On the other hand, I have had hands-on experience with the Zcam E2F6. So that's where I'm gonna be going from. But these two cameras do a lot of the same things and are a lot alike in a lot of ways. I'm gonna put the spec sheet up for both cameras on the screen right now, so you can pause and you can take a look at the frame rates and the shutter speeds. I will say the sensors are slightly different sizes, but for me personally, that's not enough to make a difference. The first thing that caught my attention and made me raise an eyebrow though was the Pyxis has only 13 stops dynamic range, whereas the E2F6 has 15 stops dynamic range. And I know that's been the first battle cry of everybody who's saying anything about any cons about the Pyxis that I've seen so far. The top of that list is dynamic range, and I do have to agree. 13 stops dynamic range is a little low, especially when you can get the Zcam that has 15 stops dynamic range for the same price. So keep that in mind. That's a point to the Zcam. Moving on from there, let's look at the back of these two cameras. First thing to notice, the Pyxis uses BPU batteries, whereas the E2F6 uses NPF batteries. Now, first of all, both kinds of batteries you can get high capacity versions of for not very much money at all. So really it's just a question of what do you have and what are you willing to get. But as I said earlier, these are riggable cameras. They're modular. They're meant to be built out. And if you're rigging out and building out your camera, you're probably using V-mount or gold mount batteries. So the kind of battery the camera uses natively doesn't matter to you because you're just gonna use a V-mount or a gold mount. And yeah, a lot of people are complaining, why doesn't the camera have native V-mount? There's actually a good reason why you wouldn't want that. Not all V-mount or gold mount batteries have a ton of ports. And if you're powering multiple accessories like a monitor, a wireless transmitter, a follow focus motor, if you're powering multiple accessories from your V-mount, you need multiple ports. And if the battery doesn't have those ports, you need to rely on a battery plate for those ports. But if you're taking that battery and putting it right on the camera, you're only powering the camera, not anything else. So there's a good solid reason why you might need a plate for your V-mount or your gold mount. But the point here is, I feel like the kind of battery the camera uses natively does not matter to the target customer because they're going to use a V-mount or a gold mount anyways. The next thing you'll notice, and here's where it might start to actually matter, the Pyxis only has SDI out, whereas the E2F6 only has HDMI out. Now we all know that SDI is the superior format. It's stronger, it's tougher, it's more reliable, there's less signal loss, it's faster, so there's less latency, so there's less delay. In general, SDI is the superior format. So for that reason, I'm gonna give a point to the Pyxis, but it also kind of depends on what other gear you have. Me personally, I'm using a monitor that has both HDMI and SDI in and out, and I'm using the wireless transmitter that has both HDMI and SDI. So for me personally, it doesn't really matter whether I use HDMI or SDI other than the lower latency and the signal strength of SDI. That's the only thing. SDI is the more professional format, and that would be the thing that would draw me to SDI over HDMI. But for me personally, I could use either, but I am going to give that point to the Pyxis. Now we turn around and we look at the front of the camera, and here's another area where the two cameras diverge. The Pyxis, as you probably are, if you're watching this, you're well aware, is being marketed as 3 different models, each one with its own lens mount. Now, a lot of people are speculating those screws around the lens mount might be removable. You might be able to interchange the lens mounts, but that's pure speculation. We do not know that for sure. That is not confirmed at this point of recording this video. That is just speculation. What we do know for sure is that Blackmagic is marketing 3 different models, each one with a different lens mount, which means at this moment in time, what we know for sure is if you have EF glass and you get the EF model of the Pyxis, you are locked into using EF lenses because you only have the EF mount. That may change later on. We don't know yet, but as of right now, that's what we know for sure. However, the E2F6 is being marketed with interchangeable lens mounts. It's one model that you can buy multiple mounts for. We know that for sure with the E2F6. For that reason, I'm going to give a point to the Zcam. Now the next thing is internal NDs. A lot of people are upset the Pyxis doesn't have internal NDs. First of all, like I've been saying this whole time, the target customer for this camera is going to rig out their camera, which means they probably have a matte box wherein they can put NDs. So that's probably less of a concern. Trust me, I completely understand how convenient internal NDs are. There are occasions where I do shoot guerrilla run and gun event type stuff. As a freelancer, I do occasionally have a client that hires me to do an event, to do run and gun stuff. For that, like I said, I'll be using a different camera. I'm just now talking about dedicated cinema cameras, and a dedicated cinema camera, like I said, you're gonna rig it out. You've got your matte box. You can put all the NDs you want in your matte box. I do understand how convenient internal NDs is, but it's also not a make or break. It's not a deal breaker because I've got a matte box. Yeah, I'll have to take a moment to put an ND filter in the matte box, but we're in a controlled environment where I can do that. We're also adjusting the lights. We're also, putting actors on their mark and blocking, and I can take 4 takes of 10 takes or whatever. That's not that big of a deal. That being said, the Zcam does have an optional lens mount with a side insert cartridge thing that has a variable ND on it. It's not exactly internal NDs, but it's close. So with the Zcam, you can have internal NDs, or close enough to internal NDs. For that reason, I'm gonna give the point to the Zcam. But again, I'm putting a ND filter in my matte box, so I'm less concerned about internal NDs. From there, we'll go look at the side of the camera, and a lot of people are complaining, why doesn't the monitor on the side of the camera flip out? And I'm sorry, I'm really not trying to come at anybody, but if you're complaining about the monitor not flipping out, then this camera is not for you. This camera is for someone who's gonna rig out their camera and use external monitors. I haven't used the onboard built-in monitor of my camera in years. I will only be using, if I were to get the Pyxis, I would only be using that side monitor to navigate menus. I do not care about, I am not going to be composing my shot with that monitor. I'm gonna have a separate monitor that I'm composing my shot with, and I feel like that is the target audience. So for that point, the Pyxis has the side monitor there. The E2F6, the Zcam, has a tiny little 1-inch monitor on the top, because they know, both of these companies know, that the target customer is not going to be using that monitor for anything but menu navigation. If you want a camera that has a flip out monitor, this camera is not for you. Get a different camera. Like, I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. Not every camera is for every shooter. Literally, even right now, as I'm recording on my Canon R, because this is a content camera, not a cinema camera in my head, I'm not even using the onboard LCD. Yes, it's flipped out just so I could see the information that it gives me, but I'm composing the shot with a built-in monitor up there. With all the things attached to this rig, I can hardly even see the built-in monitor. I'm only watching it for the info. Like, I can see my audio monitoring on there. I can see that info. I'm trusting the monitor, the external monitor, for my shot composition. And I think that's what most people are gonna be doing with this camera. So on this point, the placement and size and not movability of the monitors on these two cameras doesn't really matter to the target audience. While we're talking about the monitors, we'll talk about the menu system. Yes, Blackmagic menus are notoriously user-friendly, and yes, Zcam menus are notoriously not so much. And so for that reason, I'll give a point to the Pyxis here, because it's got the Blackmagic operating system, the Blackmagic menus. But the Zcam menus, they're not impossible. They're not all that hard. Just learn how they work and work them. Like, it's not rocket science. Just take a minute, explore the menu, figure it out, and use it. Like, people have been using way more complicated systems long before now. Like, just take a minute and learn it. It's not a big deal. And then once you learn it, it becomes like second nature. A menu system is just a menu system. Just figure it out. Yes, the Pyxis also has a bunch of buttons on the side, and I do like having tactile buttons that I can just press to change whatever settings, whereas the Zcam only has a couple tiny little buttons. It does have a function button that you can assign to it, but I will give a point to the Pyxis for all the buttons. It is pretty convenient being able to just press a button and change a setting instead of having to go into the menu every time. I'll give it that. But again, a menu system is a menu system. And if you're using either of these cameras, you're probably in a controlled environment where you can take an extra second to get into the menu system, change a setting, and expose the way you need to. Like, that's the environment these cameras are meant for. If you're shooting in a situation where you have to get the right setting real quick or you're gonna miss the moment, neither of these cameras are for you. Next, we'll talk about the wireless. Both of these cameras have a mobile app that you can use to monitor and to control the camera with. Zcam does have that. Personally, I don't like using it. I have a wireless transmitter system that can not only transmit to multiple receivers, but has its own Wi-Fi, so I can use that to monitor on my phone. And I personally prefer to just control the camera on the camera. So for me personally, and the rig that I'm going to be using it with, having a mobile app wireless connectivity from the camera is neither here nor there. Is another thing that doesn't really matter because I've got another part of my rig that will do that. Again, rigability. That's why everybody wanted a box-shaped camera, so we can rig it out, because there is a massive difference between having a camera that is meant to be rigged versus a camera that can be rigged. So going back to it, both cameras do have the mobile app and the wireless connectivity if that's something that is important to you. But we got to talk about the Blackmagic cloud system. For that reason, I'll give the point to the Pyxis. I can easily see how being able to upload the proxies to the cloud so an editor somewhere else can download those proxies and right now start editing, can easily see how that would be important and that can be useful. But while we're talking about media, here's another big area where the two cameras are going to diverge. The Pyxis uses CF Express cards, whereas the Zcam uses CFast cards. So that's a big one. Personally, I don't like external recording. I'd rather record internally. So media storage is a big one. CF Express is more reliable and is less expensive than CFast. I think CF Express in general, just all around, is the better media storage format. So having two CF Express slots over the Zcam's one CFast slot, I'm definitely going to give a strong, solid point to the Pyxis for that one. I will say that both cameras can record the full res and the proxy at the same time, but the CF Express is the superior media storage, so we'll give it to that one. We'll give a point to the Pyxis for that. Now, I'm not at NAB, so I've been like chomping at the bit for any information I can get from anybody who is at NAB and can get hands-on, because I just ran down what I know, but beyond that, I've got a lot of question marks around this camera, around the Pyxis. Enough to make me hold off on buying the Zcam just yet until I answer some of these questions. I will say there's a danger in being an early adopter. A few years back, Canon released what would be the first camera in their new mirrorless line, the Canon R, and I jumped on it as soon as it was available. That's what I'm shooting this video on right now, is the Canon R. But very quickly, after I bought that camera, Canon dropped the next few cameras in the R line, and very quickly the R became basically obsolete. If I had waited just a little bit, I could have got a much more powerful camera. Now, I'm not wholly regretting that, because the R does serve a useful function as a content camera, like I'm shooting with right now. I'm making content with it. I wouldn't take the R out to use on a cinematic shoot. It's not a cinematic camera, it's a content camera, and for that, it serves the purpose just fine. But if I had waited just a little bit, I could have got one of the big brothers of the R. There's a whole line of cameras in the R series that way outperform this camera, and I very quickly hit the limits of what this camera can do. The point I'm trying to make, the Pyxis, while it's basically the Cinema 6K in a box style camera, it is also basically the first in a new line of camera, which means you don't know how long it'll be before it becomes outdated. It could be a year from now and they're dropping the Pyxis Mark II that leaves this one in the dust. You just don't know at this point. It was just announced a couple of days ago. It's not even available to the public yet. So holding off on pulling that trigger and waiting until some reviewers have had some hands-on and we hear, you know, there may end up being some kind of problem with it we can't foresee right now. Something like overheating. Whereas the Zcam E2F6 has been around the block. It's been around for a few years. It's been around so long even that last year Zcam released the E2F6 Pro, which is basically the big brother of the E2F6. So there's a lot to be said for going with something that's been around a bit longer that has been road tested. Now, if you are jumping on it and pre-ordering because you're just chomping at the bit to get the Pyxis, that's fine. Like, go ahead. Blackmagic has certainly proved themselves to make great cameras. I'm sure it'll be a great camera. Me personally, I'm gonna wait to see some hands-on reviews, but that's just me. I advise that you maybe wait before pulling the trigger, but if you're gung-ho, go for it. I will say this though, over the past year that I've been in search of what camera I'm gonna get as my own personal camera, some of the best advice I ever got was rent first. Get your hands on the camera first. There was a minute there where I was really wanting to get the Canon C70 because I do sometimes, on the rare occasion, have a client hire me to shoot something run and gun, but primarily I'm shooting something more controlled and cinematic. So I figured the C70 as an all-arounder could handle both of those scenarios well. So I was really, for a hot minute there, I was really wanting to buy a C70. And then I rented it and shot a project with it. And while I do like the way that project turned out, I thought it looked really good. There's a lot more than just the camera that goes into making a great image. So I'm sure I could have gotten a great image out of any camera, but B, getting my hands on the C70 and getting to actually shoot a project with it made me realize I don't actually want that camera. I'll make another video about that later, but for right now I'll say that once I got to use it, I decided it's not the camera for me. So my next bit of advice, wait for the Pyxis to be available, rent it, shoot a project with it, get hands-on experience with it, and decide then. Make an informed decision before just jumping on it. That all being said, all weekend now, this whole time, I've been on the fence, but I think this last little bit of information is going to be the decision maker for me. I think I came across the thing that's going to make up my mind, and that thing is B-RAW. Before I continue, I like B-RAW. I'm not going to say anything bad about B-RAW. It's a great codec. I have shot with it many times. I have edited it with many times. My feature film was shot on the Ursa Mini Pro in B-RAW, which, by the way, is now streaming for free on Tubi, and it would really help me out and the movie out if you went and watched it for free. But it was shot in B-RAW. I love B-RAW. It's a great codec, and there are certainly situations where it is called for, but not all the time. But not every situation. The Pyxis can only shoot B-RAW. And I don't always, all the time, only ever want to be shooting in B-RAW. If, for example, I'm shooting something that I'm gonna hand off to someone else, with Company X, 4 times a year, every quarter, we shoot a bunch of B-roll that we hand off to local news networks that they can edit up how they want to use in their segments that they report about what we're doing. When we do that, the news networks request specifically that we give them ProRes footage. I can't send them B-RAW. I can't send them Blackmagic RAW footage. I have to send them ProRes, which means if I were to shoot this B-roll footage on the Pyxis, I would then have to transcode that footage to ProRes before I send it to them, which adds a whole other step in the post process. But if I shoot it on something else, like the Zcam, I can shoot it in ProRes and then just deliver directly without having to worry about transcoding. There are other times with Company X that I shoot something I'm gonna hand to another department, another editor, or someone else who's gonna handle it, and I cannot always trust that they're gonna be able to handle B-RAW. Blackmagic RAW is a great codec and I do like it, but it requires a Blackmagic plugin to be able to run. You can't just natively run it in Premiere. You have to have the plugin. Not everybody has the plugin. And before you say it, in the professional setting that Company X is, I can't use DaVinci Resolve. Everyone is on the Adobe suite. We're using Premiere. In the professional world, we're using Premiere. Yes, I know. Well, we could have a whole other conversation about which is the better NLE, Premiere or DaVinci Resolve, but I use Premiere. I'm a Premiere user, and I like it, and I have to be. Yes, DaVinci Resolve is far superior for color grading, but I'm editing in Premiere. That's a video for another day. Right now, what I'm saying is I can't use B-Raw in Premiere without the plugin. If I'm shooting something that I'm gonna edit, that's fine, because I have the plugin. I can handle it. I can work with B-Raw. I do all the time. And when I go to shoot my next feature, I'm gonna hire a DP with a Blackmagic, and I wanna do it in B-Raw. But for my camera that I have as my personal camera, I don't want to be locked into only shooting B-Raw. And here's the thing, and unfortunately the Pyxis, the Cinema 6K, the new Ursas, everything from the Ursa 12K on is only locked into shooting B-Raw. Basically, Blackmagic doesn't want to pay the Apple licensing fee for ProRes, which I totally get from a business point of view. That makes a lot of sense. They're using their proprietary software. But I don't all the time only ever want to be stuck in shooting B-Raw. And that's the thing that is tipping me over. That's kind of the deal breaker. I do like B-Raw. I would love to shoot in B-Raw, but just not only. I want the option, essentially, and I want to pick the right codec for the right situation. With Zcam, they have ProRes, and they have Z-Raw. They have their own version of RAW. So with the Zcam, you can still shoot in RAW, but you can also shoot in ProRes. That's the make or break difference. That's the deal breaker for me. So at this moment in time, the way things sit right now, and for the foreseeable future, I think I'm gonna stick to Zcam. Now, that might not matter to you, because at the end of the day, a camera is a tool, and you wanna use the right tool for the right job. Now, again, that's just me personally. My advice to you would be to take stock of your specific needs. What are you shooting? What's your situation? And figure out the camera that works best for you and your specific use scenario. That being said, I'm Thomas Tulloch, and this is Filmmakering Like a Boss.